Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive paradigm shift, and honestly, it's going to challenge just about everything we think we know about addiction. For decades, the way we've categorized, judged, and even treated addictive behaviors has been stuck in this really rigid, deeply entrenched binary. But right now, new perspectives from leading researchers and clinical psychologists are blowing that old framework wide open. We're going to look at some truly fascinating new models today that completely reframe human behavior, motivation, and honestly, the very nature of how our brains learn.
So you've probably heard this debate a million times, right? Is addiction a disease or is it a moral failure? It is the ultimate question that has dominated our societal conversation for generations. And if you follow this space at all, you know exactly how polarizing this gets. But what if I told you that both of these traditional views kind of miss the mark? Actually, they're both fundamentally flawed. They both hit a massive wall when it comes to explaining the real, messy reality of how addiction actually operates out there in the real world.
And this perfectly captures the paradox we've been trapped in. On one hand, you've got the moral failure model, which is super heavily tied to our criminal legal system. We literally criminalize addiction, operating on the assumption that it's all just bad choices. But on the flip side, you have the traditional biomedical disease model. Now, advocates push this to reduce stigma, which is great, by likening addiction to an involuntary illness, kind of like Alzheimer's. But here's the massive contradiction that author and researcher Maya Shalovitz points out. Addictive behavior is not completely involuntary. Think about it. Someone with Alzheimer's cannot be motivated to remember something, no matter what incentive you offer them. But a person struggling with addiction, they often have to plan meticulously. They strategize, they hide their use, they can even hit pause and refrain from using when they absolutely have to, like, say, during a court appearance. So it's not entirely involuntary, but it's clearly not just a free will moral failure either.
Let's move to Section 1, Learning Disorder, a Developmental View.
So if addiction isn't a moral failing and it isn't a totally involuntary disease, what exactly is it? Well, to understand this new framework, we have to look at the timeline. Get this, 75%. That is a staggering number. 75% of all mental illnesses and the vast majority of addictions begin during adolescence and early adulthood. Why? Because this is an absolutely crucial, highly sensitive developmental period. Your brain is literally under construction, undergoing massive rewiring.
So during our youth, the cortical and subcortical areas of the brain are desperately rewiring for socialization, reproduction, and independence. The drive to find a mate and connect with peers is one of the absolute most powerful motivations a human being ever experiences. Think about what happens when people fall in love or, have a child. They completely rewire their life priorities to protect that relationship. Shalovitz argues that drug addiction is essentially what occurs when this intense, fundamental survival force, that incredible falling in love mechanism, is hijacked and misdirected toward a substance. The brain essentially learns that the substance is the single most vital relationship in that person's life.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the trap. Over the course of an addiction, the behavior shifts. It starts out completely voluntary, but through repeated learning, it becomes automatic. As this quote lays out perfectly, it is exactly like learning to play the piano or drive a car. When you first get behind the wheel, you're consciously thinking about every little movement, right? But eventually, your brain automates it. You don't think, you just drive. But when that deeply ingrained automated learning gets applied to a destructive habit, escaping the loop becomes incredibly difficult. It's not that the person lost their free will, it's that the brain has so profoundly learned to desire this thing, and unlearning it takes an immense amount of effort.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, Transdiagnostic Shift, Moving Beyond Labels.
So, if addiction is really a learning disorder that's shaped by context and motivation, how does clinical psychology actually treat it? Well, this brings us to a massive movement happening right now in the field. A recent issue of the journal Papeles del Psicólogo published a comprehensive monographic on this exact topic. The scientific and clinical communities are basically having a wake-up call, realizing that traditional diagnostic manuals like the DSM are actually pretty limited. They basically just hand out labels based on symptom counting. But in reality, having multiple struggles at once, or co-occurrence, is the rule, not the exception. So leading journals are really pushing professionals to move away from isolated labels and instead look at the universal variables that keep people stuck.
Okay, big word here, transdiagnostic. But what does that actually mean for the average person seeking help? Simply put, it means we're looking at the why and the how of your behavior, not just slapping a name on the what. Instead of a doctor saying, you have an alcohol use disorder, let's just treat the alcohol, a transdiagnostic approach says, hold on, Let's look at the underlying psychological processes, things like emotional regulation or impulsivity, that are driving not just the drinking, but maybe your crippling anxiety and your relationship struggles too. It breaks down those medical silos completely. Let's pop the hood for a second and look at how this works. When clinicians use this approach, they zero in on some key contextual variables. First, motivation for change. How do we navigate the totally natural ambivalence a person feels about giving up their primary coping mechanism? Next, life values. Can we help them discover real meaning beyond the addiction? Because from an existential standpoint, addiction is often just filling a massive void of meaninglessness. Then there's social support. Are we building networks that provide emotional and, frankly, actual tangible help? And finally, alternative reinforcers. This one is huge. Are there non-drug activities available in this person's environment that actually bring them genuine joy? Because if you just rip the drug away without addressing these variables, the treatment is absolutely bound to fail.
Which leads us to Section 3, Impulsivity, Mechanics of Choice.
So how does the brain actually calculate the economics of the choices we make? It all comes down to this concept called delayed discounting. People with addiction problems often make what look like highly irrational decisions to the outside world. But behavioral economics explains this perfectly. The brain is constantly weighing an immediate reinforcer, like the instant euphoria or the immediate relief from withdrawal that a drug gives, against a delayed, higher value, like long-term health, saving up money, or keeping your family together. Because the drug's reward is right now, the brain drastically discounts the value of the delayed reward, even though, objectively speaking, we all know the delayed reward is way more important.
And look, there are specific factors driving these impulsive choices. It's not just a generic lack of willpower, which is what people always assume. Some folks literally have a hyperactive behavioral activation system, or BAS. That means they're incredibly sensitive to rewards and they're constantly seeking them out. Then you add in positive and negative urgency, which is the tendency to act rashly, specifically when you are experiencing super intense positive or negative emotions. Couple all of that with difficulties in emotion regulation and a lack of premeditation, and you have a literal perfect storm in the brain where the immediate relief of a substance is always going to win out in a moment of stress.
Section 4, Context Matters, Alternative Reinforcers.
So, if addiction is a learning disorder that's deeply, intimately tied to our environment and the availability of rewards, how do we actually fix it? You might have heard of the famous rat park experiment. It's a real game changer. If you take a rat and put it in an isolated, empty cage with nothing but regular water and drug-laced water, it will consume the drugs until it literally dies. But if you take that exact same rat and put it in Rat Park, which is this incredibly rich environment with toys, space to roam, and other rats to play and socialize with, they almost entirely ignore the drug water. It's wild. This brilliantly illustrates that individuals are not just hooked by the chemical properties of a drug. They're hooked by what the drug provides when their environment is completely devoid of natural alternative reinforcers.
And this is exactly why modern psychological frameworks, like those promoted by foundations such as Grupo Editorial de Psicofundación, are shifting their focus entirely. Treatment cannot just be about taking the substance away and locking someone in a room. It has to be about treating the entire context of the individual. We have to actively increase their access to natural reinforcers in the real world. And we also need to teach concrete skills, like mindfulness, which is really just paying attention to the present moment. Research consistently shows that mindfulness training helps break that automatic, impulsive loop we were talking about earlier. It creates this tiny, crucial pause between the trigger and the automatic habit, finally allowing the person to choose a different path.
And finally, Section 5, A New Path Forward, Healing the Context.
When we pull back and synthesize this entire developmental and transdiagnostic model, it dictates a fundamentally different approach to human healing. The absolute most crucial point to take away from all of this is that healing requires changing the context. Addiction is fundamentally defined as persistence despite negative consequences. Really think about that for a second. It is literally a failure to learn from punishment. So the whole idea that we can somehow solve addiction by just punishing people harder, whether that's through the criminal justice system or just sheer societal shame, is not only absurd, it's scientifically proven to be totally ineffective. We have to pivot. We have to start teaching concrete emotional skills, rebuilding life values, and ensuring people have access to a life that is actually worth living without the drug.
I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. If addiction is a developmental learning disorder, this automated habit born from a deeply misdirected human drive, think about how we handle other learning issues in our society. If a student is failing to learn math, we don't punish them, right? We change our teaching methods and we help them understand the concepts. So why on earth do we aggressively punish people for an inability to learn from consequences? Understanding addiction this way finally sidesteps those endless, exhausting debates over disease versus sin. Honestly, it's an idea whose time has come. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.